The city was alive with the usual hum of traffic, the rush of the morning crowd, and the occasional honk of a car horn. But for Billionaire CEO John Thornton, none of that mattered today. As he walked briskly through the busy streets on his way to work, his mind was preoccupied with meetings and business deals, the weight of his empire always on his shoulders. His life, seemingly perfect on the surface, had become a series of calculated decisions and carefully managed chaos. But as he stepped into the crosswalk, something changed, something that would alter the course of his life forever. A screeching sound tore through the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of tires squealing. Before he could even process what was happening, a small figure darted into the street, chasing after a ball that had rolled too far. A baby girl. Without thinking, John lunged forward, shoving the child out of the way just as the speeding car swerved to miss them both. The screeching tires came to a halt just inches away, leaving the pair shaken but alive. John's heart pounded in his chest as he pulled the girl into his arms, checking her for injuries. She was crying, terrified, her tiny body trembling from the shock. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. It's okay," he whispered, trying to calm her, his hands gently patting her back. He glanced around, hoping someone would step in, but the street was eerily quiet now, the chaos of the moment fading away into stillness. The baby girl's soft sobs were the only sound as John cradled her close. His heart, for the first time in years, felt something other than the cold, calculated rhythms of his corporate world. His arms, usually steady in boardrooms, now trembled as he realized the depth of the responsibility that had just been thrust upon him. His eyes scanned the street, looking for any sign of the child's parents. No one. The moment was surreal, a strange feeling creeping over him. The girl wasn't his, yet he couldn't bring himself to let her go. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion, though he couldn't quite understand why he felt so connected to her already. The little girl looked up at him, her face still wet with tears, but her eyes, deep, searching, seemed to hold a hint of something familiar, something that felt like an echo from the past. As John tried to steady himself, a thought struck him like a bolt of lightning: what if this child had some connection to his past? Just as quickly as the thought came, it vanished, replaced by the overwhelming reality of the situation. He needed to get help. But as he looked at the child, he felt an unexpected pang of something deeper: responsibility. His first instinct was to protect her, no questions asked. Still holding the girl, he hurried towards a nearby cafe, hoping to find someone who could assist. His mind raced, he had no idea who this girl was, or why he was suddenly so compelled to take care of her. But something about the situation felt strange. The girl's tear-streaked face, her trembling form, it seemed like more than just a random act of fate. It felt like something was drawing him in. As he entered the cafe, the staff reacted swiftly, calling the authorities. But in the back of his mind, John couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this was no accident. As he waited for the police to arrive, he looked down at the baby girl, who had stopped crying and was now gazing up at him with those hauntingly familiar eyes. His mind buzzed with questions, each one louder than the last. Who was she? Why did she feel so connected to him? Little did John know, this moment, the rescue of an innocent child, was the beginning of a journey that would unravel his past and change the trajectory of his life in ways he could never have imagined. But it was too soon to know. The only thing John Thornton was sure of right now was that he had saved this child. And he had no idea what was about to happen next. The hospital was sterile and quiet, the buzz of medical staff a distant hum in the background as John paced outside the emergency room. His mind was racing, filled with the echo of that haunting feeling. Something about the girl's eyes, the way she had looked at him, seemed too familiar. He couldn't place it. She was just a child, and yet, in that moment, everything about her felt as though it were tethered to something far deeper, something he'd buried long ago. Nurses and doctors went about their work, but John couldn't shake the anxiety gnawing at him. He had called in a few favors, ensuring that the girl was checked out thoroughly, but his mind kept returning to that strange, nagging feeling. Who was she? Why had fate thrown her into his path today? And why did he feel like this wasn't a random encounter at all? A soft tap on his shoulder broke his reverie. He turned around to see Lydia, his ex-wife, standing there, her face a mask of concern and confusion. Her presence was jarring, a sharp contrast to the calm demeanor he tried to maintain. "John," Lydia said softly, her voice hesitant. I heard what happened. Are you all right?" The words barely registered. John's heart skipped a beat. His ex-wife had arrived, and the weight of their past filled the space between them like a silent storm. They hadn't spoken in years, not since their messy, painful divorce. She looked older now, the lines around her eyes deeper, but still, there was something familiar, something that drew him in against his will. "I'm fine," he replied stiffly. "But it's about her, Lydia." He motioned to the small, quiet girl lying in the hospital bed, connected to machines that beeped and hummed around her frail body. "Who is she?" Lydia's face went pale. She took a step back, as if the question had physically struck her. She glanced at the child, then back at John, before answering in a whisper, She's ours, John." John's world seemed to collapse in on itself. His breath caught in his chest as the words lingered in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. "Ours?" he repeated. "What do you mean, ours?" Lydia sighed deeply, her eyes dark with years of hidden emotions. "She's your daughter, John. Our daughter. Her name is Lily." The name hit him like a punch to the gut. Lily. His child. His mind raced. The realization was as brutal as it was sudden. He had no memory of her, no recollection of ever being told that he had a child with Lydia. They had been divorced for over 5 years, and during their time together, they had tried for a family countless times, only to be met with heartbreak. He had assumed their inability to have children was just part of their painful reality, but now, this. Lydia took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "I didn't tell you, John. I couldn't. It was too complicated. I wanted to raise her on my own. I didn't want to drag you into this life. I didn't want you to feel obligated." John stood motionless, unable to comprehend the gravity of what he was hearing. The baby girl, the one he had saved from certain danger, was his flesh and blood. His daughter. It was almost impossible to wrap his head around it. "Why now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, the weight of disbelief still sinking in. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Lydia shifted uncomfortably, looking at her hands before meeting his gaze. "I thought you didn't want to know. After everything that happened, I wasn't sure if you'd even care. But now you're here. And she's sick, John. She needs you." The word sick reverberated in his mind, cutting through his fog of confusion. What did that mean? Was she in danger? Was this why she was in the hospital? Was it too late for them to become a family after all these years? "Lydia, what's going on?" His voice cracked as he demanded answers. "What's wrong with her?" Lydia's eyes welled up, the tears threatening to spill over. "Lily has a rare condition, John. We've been trying everything. The doctors have done what they can, but," she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. John's heart clenched. A wave of guilt, shame, and fear washed over him. How had he not known? How could he have been so distant, so wrapped up in his own world, that he hadn't even known about his daughter's existence, let alone her health? As Lydia explained the details of Lily's condition, John felt the weight of everything he had missed. His daughter, his flesh and blood, was lying in a hospital bed, sick, and fighting for her life, and he had no idea how to help her. But in that moment, something else shifted inside him. A flicker of resolve. This was his daughter. No matter how much time he had lost, no matter how much pain there had been in the past, he couldn't ignore the truth anymore. He couldn't walk away from her. His gaze settled on Lydia, his ex-wife. Their past was filled with betrayal, regret, and mistakes, but for the first time in years, John realized that their shared responsibility, their daughter, was something they could no longer run from. With a heavy heart, he nodded slowly, the weight of the moment crashing over him. "I'm here," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here for her, Lydia." But as John looked at Lily, lying there so fragile and vulnerable, he knew that this was only the beginning. There were still many unanswered questions, many battles ahead. And he had no idea where this journey would take him, but for the first time, he was willing to find out. The days that followed Lily's hospitalization were a blur of medical tests, sleepless nights, and strained conversations. John found himself constantly torn between the responsibilities of his corporate world and the overwhelming need to be by his daughter's side. The world he had once known, a world of boardrooms, luxury, and control, seemed like a distant memory as he sat by Lily's bedside, holding her tiny hand, willing her to get better. But the situation was far from simple. The doctors had explained that Lily's rare condition required expensive treatments that were not fully covered by insurance. Lydia had been managing things on her own, but the financial burden was overwhelming. John found himself stepping into a role he never imagined he would play, the protector, the provider, the father. One evening, as he sat in the waiting room, his mind racing, Lydia approached him. Her face was tense, her eyes filled with an unspoken fear. "John," she began, her voice quiet. "There's something you need to know. I've been trying to protect you from this, but I can't keep it from you anymore." John's heart dropped. The words she spoke felt like they carried the weight of the world. "What is it, Lydia?" he asked, bracing himself for more bad news. She looked around the room, ensuring no one was nearby, before she lowered her voice. "Lily's condition, it's genetic." John's mind immediately raced to 1,000 possibilities, all of them terrifying. Was it something he had passed down to her? Was there a chance that his DNA was responsible for her suffering? "You need to get tested, John," Lydia said, her voice shaking. "The doctors need to know if you have the same condition. If you do, we need to act fast. You're the only match for a potential cure." John's world spun. His mind flashed back to his younger years. He remembered the endless nights of stress and work, of pushing everything else aside, even his own health. He had never given much thought to his genetics, his family history. It had always been a distant concern, something he could avoid in favor of his career. But now, the reality was impossible to ignore. His daughter needed him. "No, Lydia, I can't have this," John stammered. His hands trembled as he processed the devastating truth. The thought of being tested, of knowing that he might be carrying a gene that could harm his daughter, was too much for him to bear. "You have to, John," Lydia pressed. "If you want to save her, you need to face this. She needs you. I need you. We need to know if you're the match." The words hung in the air like a suffocating fog. John felt as though he were trapped in a nightmare, caught between the fear of losing his daughter and the shame of potentially passing on a deadly gene. But in that moment, he realized that his fear of facing the truth was nothing compared to the fear of losing Lily. He had already lost so much time with her, and if there was any chance to make it right, to save her, he had to act. "All right," John finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll do it. I'll get tested." Lydia nodded, a faint glimmer of relief in her eyes. But even as she turned to leave, John's mind was still racing. Could he really be the cause of her suffering? The uncertainty gnawed at him, threatening to overwhelm him entirely. The next few days passed in a haze. John underwent the genetic tests, each moment leading to a new round of dread and anticipation. Every conversation with the doctors, every test result, felt like a step closer to the truth, and every step was more terrifying than the last. Finally, the day arrived when the results were in. The doctor asked John to meet with him privately, a grave look on his face. John's stomach twisted with anxiety as he followed the doctor into his office. The doctor's words were blunt and to the point. "Mr. Thornton, the tests have come back, and I'm afraid you do carry the same genetic condition that Lily has. It's a rare mutation, and it's affecting both of you." John's heart sank, his chest tightening with the weight of the revelation. He had been right. His own body, the one he had taken for granted, the one he had neglected in favor of his career, was now responsible for the suffering of the child he had just discovered existed. "I'm sorry," the doctor continued, his voice steady but empathetic. "But there is still hope. With the right treatment, we may be able to save her. However, we need to act quickly." The doctor's words didn't sink in immediately. All John could hear was the pounding of his own heart, his thoughts spiraling into chaos. He was the cause. For the first time in his life, John felt completely helpless. He had built an empire. He had faced challenges that would have broken other men, yet this was something beyond his control. He couldn't fix it with money. He couldn't fix it with influence. But there was one thing he could do. He could be there. Despite the guilt, despite the overwhelming fear that gripped him, John knew that his daughter needed him. He had no idea what the future held, but he would fight for her, he would do whatever it took to be the father she deserved. The path ahead would be filled with uncertainty, but John was finally ready to walk it. For Lily. For his daughter. He would not fail her. The days that followed the test results were filled with a mix of hope and despair. John tried to focus on work, on his empire, but it felt meaningless compared to what was happening at home. Every conversation, every meeting, every deal, felt like a hollow distraction. His mind kept drifting back to Lily, to the baby girl lying in a hospital bed, fighting for her life, while he sat here trying to pretend everything was still normal. He couldn't concentrate on anything. The guilt gnawed at him constantly. Every time he looked at her, at the fragile child who shared his blood, he felt an overwhelming urge to make up for all the lost time, all the moments he could never get back. He had missed her childhood. He had missed so much. And now, he was trying to navigate the delicate balance of being a father to a child who barely knew him, while also grappling with the shocking realization that he might not have the strength to save her. Lydia was by his side through all of this, though their relationship had never been easy. They had been through so much, betrayal, broken promises, and misunderstandings, and yet, here they were, brought together by their daughter, who was somehow a reminder of everything they had once shared. They sat in the sterile hospital room together, the machines beeping softly in the background. John reached out to take Lily's small hand, his fingers trembling as he stroked her skin. The weight of his responsibility was heavy, but the love that bloomed within him for this tiny girl was undeniable. Lydia watched him silently, her expression unreadable. She had kept so much from him over the years, her struggles, her fears, and most of all, the decision to raise Lily alone. But now, in this room, surrounded by the sounds of machines and the faint smell of antiseptic, they were connected again, in a way neither of them had expected. "I've been thinking," Lydia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About everything. About us, about Lily. And I'm sorry, John. I never should have kept her from you." John looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "Lydia, I don't blame you. I didn't know. I wasn't there. I didn't even know I had a daughter, let alone the responsibility that came with it." Lydia sighed, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I should have told you. But I was scared. Scared you wouldn't want her. Or me." John nodded, understanding more than she knew. "I was so consumed by my career. I didn't have room for anything else. But now everything has changed. I can't just walk away from her." They were silent for a long moment, the weight of their shared regret hanging heavily between them. John was still grappling with the truth, the overwhelming realization that his own body, his own DNA, was the reason his daughter was suffering. It was a bitter pill to swallow, one that lodged itself in his throat, making it hard to breathe. He had spent his entire life building walls around his emotions, pretending they didn't matter. But here, with Lily, those walls were crumbling. The guilt, the fear, the pain, it was all consuming him. But there was something else, too. A spark of determination. He would do whatever it took to save her. And then, in the quiet of that sterile room, as he sat beside his daughter's bed, John made a promise to himself. He wasn't going to let his daughter suffer. He wasn't going to let her slip away, not when he had just found her. He would fight, no matter the cost. He turned to Lydia, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I'll do anything to help her. Whatever she needs. I'll make sure she has it." Lydia's eyes softened. "You'll have to fight, John. It won't be easy. It'll take everything you have, but if we can find the right treatment, if we can fight this together, we can save her." John nodded, his resolve hardening. "We will. I won't let her go." But even as he spoke those words, a new wave of fear washed over him. The doctors had already warned him that time was running out. Every passing day was a reminder of just how precarious Lily's condition was. The treatments they needed, the steps they had to take, it was all so much, so overwhelming. And yet, John couldn't bring himself to give up. He was a man who had built his life around power, control, and success. But none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was his daughter. In the quiet of the night, as he stayed by her side, John made another silent promise: he would not fail her. He had spent too long running from his past, from the things that mattered most. But this, his daughter, his flesh and blood, was something he could never run from. He was all in now. For her. For Lily. The days blurred together in a haze of hospital visits, phone calls to specialists, and countless discussions with Lydia. John threw himself into the fight to save Lily with a tenacity he had never known he had. The once cold CEO, whose every move had been calculated and deliberate, was now learning the true meaning of sacrifice and love. Each day, the weight of responsibility seemed to grow heavier, but so did his resolve. He wasn't just fighting for a child he had only just met, he was fighting for a future he'd never imagined for himself. John's company had always come first, his success measured in profit margins and boardroom victories. But in the sterile, white-walled world of the hospital, his world of power, control, and influence felt meaningless. It no longer mattered how many zeros were in his bank account. What mattered now was the life of the little girl lying in the bed, fighting for every breath. The doctors had been clear: the treatment Lily needed was experimental and risky. It could give her a chance at life, or it could make things worse. They needed a bone marrow transplant, but John wasn't just her potential donor, he was her only chance. He had already agreed to the test, and now the results were in. John was a match. It was a relief and a burden all at once. The operation was scheduled, and for the first time since this whirlwind began, John found himself facing a real choice. Would he be brave enough to take the leap, to place his trust in the hands of doctors who held his daughter's fate in their hands? As he sat in the waiting room, alone, the weight of the moment hit him hard. The success of the transplant didn't just depend on the doctors or the medical procedure, it depended on him, on his ability to handle the stress, the fear, and the unknown. Lydia sat beside him now, her eyes red from the sleepless nights she, too, had spent worrying about Lily's health. The tension between them had eased, the shared responsibility bringing them closer together in a way they hadn't been in years. They hadn't been able to erase the past, the hurt, the betrayal, the anger, but in the shared purpose of saving their daughter, they had found common ground. "How are you holding up?" Lydia asked softly, her hand resting on his arm. John exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping nervously against the armrest. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've spent my life making decisions that affect millions of people, but none of that matters now. This is different. This is life or death." Lydia looked at him, her gaze softening. "I know, John. But you're doing the right thing. You're not doing this alone. You're doing it for her." He nodded, his thoughts clouded by the weight of her words. This was a decision unlike any other he had made. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. And yet, despite the fear and the uncertainty, he knew deep down that he couldn't back out now. Lily needed him. The doors to the operating room opened, and a nurse called his name. It was time. John stood up slowly, his body feeling heavy with the weight of everything that had led to this moment. Lydia squeezed his hand gently before letting go, offering him a look of support. "You've got this," she whispered. "We'll be right here waiting." He nodded again, his heart pounding in his chest as he followed the nurse down the hallway. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this afraid, this vulnerable. But as he walked toward the operating room, he realized something that surprised him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of losing control. He was ready to let go. He was ready to place everything, his trust, his hope, his daughter's life, in the hands of the doctors and the love he had found within himself for Lily. The hours that followed felt like an eternity. John sat in the cold waiting room, his mind swirling with questions and doubts. Would she be okay? Would he have done enough? But more than that, would he be enough? Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the doctor emerged from the operating room. His face was weary, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "She's stable," the doctor said. "The transplant was successful. We'll need to monitor her closely, but it looks like she's going to pull through." Relief washed over John in a flood, his knees weakening as the weight of the news settled over him. He hadn't realized how tightly he had been holding his breath, how much fear had been choking him, until he could finally exhale. Lydia was by his side in an instant, her hands clutching his as they both absorbed the news. John's mind felt foggy, his body drained from the emotional roller coaster of the last few days, but there was one undeniable truth: Lily was going to be okay. As the days passed, Lily's condition slowly improved. John spent every moment by her side, watching as she fought, as she grew stronger. The small victories, the moments when her breathing steadied, when she opened her eyes and smiled, were the moments that kept him going. But even as Lily began to recover, John knew that the real battle had only just begun. The past had shaped who he was, but the future, his future with Lily, was something he had yet to understand. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, about finding a way to build a family, despite the scars of the past. It was about forgiveness, not just for Lydia, but for himself. And for the first time in his life, John Thornton wasn't afraid of the unknown. He didn't need control anymore. He had something far more precious now, a second chance. Weeks passed, and life began to settle into a new, fragile rhythm. John found himself spending every spare moment by Lily's side. The hospital visits were frequent, and each time he left, he felt a mix of hope and anxiety. His daughter was slowly but steadily recovering, but the journey was far from over. Her recovery was fragile, and while the transplant had been a success, there was still the looming uncertainty of what the future held. John had been a man who thrived on control, who prided himself on having a clear path, a strategy for everything. But this was different. This was uncharted territory. There were no guarantees, no timelines to follow. All he could do was be there for Lily, every single step of the way. The bond between them had deepened in ways John hadn't expected. There were moments of pure connection, when Lily, now able to sit up in bed for short periods, would reach out for him. Her small fingers wrapped around his, and in those moments, everything else faded away. The world of billion-dollar deals, business meetings, and boardroom victories seemed so distant compared to the simple joy of being with her, watching her fight to live, to survive. Lydia, too, was there every day. She had become the rock John never expected her to be. They were no longer the strangers they had been for years. There was a sense of shared purpose between them now, a partnership that had been forged through their daughter's illness. John saw a new side of Lydia, the mother who had fought tirelessly for their daughter, who had carried the weight of this alone until he finally stepped in. And in return, John was giving everything he had to ensure that their family, broken as it may have been, could heal. But as the weeks turned into months, something inside John began to shift. The guilt, the anger, the regret, it all started to fade, replaced by a quiet realization: he wasn't just fighting for Lily. He was fighting for a chance to rewrite his own story. To become the father he should have been. To prove to Lily, and to himself, that he could be someone worthy of her love and trust. Then one afternoon, as John sat at Lily's bedside, holding her hand and reading her favorite story, a nurse entered the room with a hopeful expression. "Mr. Thornton," the nurse said gently, "Lily's test results came back. The doctors are seeing improvement, better than expected. Her body is starting to accept the transplant. There's a chance that her condition could stabilize fully within the next few weeks. She might make a full recovery." John's heart raced. He looked at the nurse, then down at Lily, her small chest rising and falling with each breath. Her eyes were closed, but he could see the faintest hint of a smile on her lips, as though she could sense that things were beginning to shift in her favor. Lydia entered the room just as the news was delivered, her face lighting up as the nurse finished speaking. She rushed to John's side, her eyes brimming with tears. "She's going to be okay," Lydia whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. John didn't know what to say. He wanted to cry, to laugh, to shout for joy, but instead, he simply held on to Lily's hand tighter, as though afraid she might slip away from him again. The next few days were a blur of optimism and cautious celebration. John and Lydia both began to allow themselves to believe that the worst was behind them, though they knew the road ahead would still be long. There would be follow-up treatments, there would be more tests, and they would have to monitor Lily's health closely for years to come. But for the first time in a long while, John found himself looking forward to the future, to the possibility of a life with his daughter that he had never imagined. But even as hope bloomed in his heart, John couldn't ignore the quiet voice of doubt that still lingered at the back of his mind. What if something went wrong? What if this wasn't the end of the story? But as he looked at his daughter, he realized something he had missed for so many years: life was never about certainty. It was about the choices we make in the face of uncertainty. It was about the people we choose to love and the sacrifices we are willing to make for them. The breakthrough wasn't just in Lily's health, it was in John himself. He had come to terms with the fact that his past mistakes didn't define him. His future was his to shape, and Lily was the light guiding him toward a new beginning. Lydia and John spent more time together in those days, talking about the future in a way they hadn't in years. There were still unresolved issues between them, old wounds that hadn't fully healed. But they both knew that they had something now that was worth fighting for, a daughter who needed both of them, a family that, though imperfect, was theirs to rebuild. And so, as the days passed and Lily's health continued to improve, John Thornton, the billionaire CEO who had once been consumed by his empire, found himself embracing a new role, that of a father. Not just in name, but in action. He had made mistakes, yes, but he was determined to make things right. For Lily. For himself. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, and there would be moments of doubt. But for the first time in his life, John felt something more powerful than fear. He felt hope. And that hope was enough to guide him into a future he had never expected, a future where love, family, and redemption were his greatest achievements. The months that followed Lily's recovery were a whirlwind of emotions. John had witnessed her transformation from a frail, sick child into a vibrant, playful little girl. Each step, each milestone, felt like a victory, one that was hard-earned and deeply cherished. For the first time in his life, John truly understood what it meant to be present, to be a father, not just in title, but in every sense of the word. As Lily grew stronger, so did the bond between John and Lydia. They weren't the same couple who had once been torn apart by bitterness and regret. No, they were two people who had come to understand each other in ways they never had before, united by their shared love for their daughter. They spent more time together, co-parenting in a way that felt natural, despite the years of distance between them. John had learned many things over the course of this journey, but the most important lesson was one he had never expected: it's never too late to change. For years, John had built his life around control, around his career, around a world where numbers and power defined success. But in the quiet moments with Lily, when she laughed, when she ran to him with her arms wide open, or when she simply curled up next to him and fell asleep, he realized that the most meaningful moments in life weren't those he had spent in boardrooms or behind a desk. They were the moments that made him feel alive, connected, and human. They were the moments with her, with his daughter. Lydia, too, had changed. She was no longer the woman who had been forced to carry the weight of parenthood alone. John had stepped up, and she had let him. They had learned to trust each other again, not just because they had to, but because they wanted to, for Lily's sake and for their own. One sunny afternoon, as they sat together in the park, watching Lily play with the other children, John found himself reflecting on everything that had led him here. His empire was still there, still strong, but it no longer defined him. He was no longer just the CEO. He was a father. He was a man who had made mistakes but had also been given the chance to make things right. Lydia looked over at him, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude. She had always known that John was capable of change, but seeing him now, seeing him as a father, as someone who cared deeply for their daughter, was something she never could have imagined when they were first married. The road to this moment had been long, and it hadn't been easy. But in the end, they had found each other again. They had found something worth fighting for. "John," Lydia said, her voice soft but firm, "I just want you to know that I never doubted you." "Not really. I knew you'd come through for us." John smiled, the weight of the past finally lifting. "I don't think I ever truly understood what it meant to be a father. I've always been so focused on what I could achieve, on what I could control. But now, I see that the most important things in life can't be controlled. They can only be loved. And I've learned that the hard way." Lydia nodded, squeezing his hand. "You've learned it, John. And that's what matters." As they watched Lily play, laughing as she chased after a butterfly, John felt an overwhelming sense of peace. There was still much work to be done, still many challenges ahead, but for the first time, he felt equipped to face them, not as the man he had once been, but as the man he was becoming. A father. A partner. A man who had learned to love, to forgive, and to grow. Life wasn't perfect. There were still scars, still memories of the mistakes he had made, the time he had lost. But the past no longer held him captive. He had a future now, one where love and family were his guiding lights. And as he looked at Lily, his heart swelling with pride, he knew that whatever happened next, he would face it with her by his side. He had been given a second chance, a chance to rewrite the story he had once thought was already set in stone. And this time, he would make it count. With Lily's laughter echoing in the distance, John Thornton knew that the greatest success of his life wasn't measured in billions, but in the joy of holding his daughter in his arms, in the quiet moments when they were simply together. And in those moments, he knew that he had everything he needed to be the father she deserved.